Cosa vuoi dire ai giovani?
Не знаю. Думаю, что мне бы хотелось сказать им только то, что чтобы они умели больше находиться в одиночестве. Любили бы быть наедине с самим собой почаще. Мне кажется, что беда нынешней молодежи заключается в том, что она старается как-то объединиться на основе каких-то очень шумных действий, порой даже агрессивных. Вот это желание объединиться для того, чтобы не чувствовать себя одиноким, это очень неприятный и такой симптом, с моей точки зрения. Мне кажется, человек должен учиться с детства находиться одному. То есть это не значит, что быть одиноким, это значит, что уметь не скучать самим собой, потому что человек, который скучает от одиночества, мне представляется человеком, находящимся в опасности.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to The Anadromist. This is Burn Power with a few things on my mind, and I thought I would unfurl them for you. Well, things are kind of strange here in Tbilisi, and there's protesting in the streets, all sorts of government and crowd shenanigans. And I will be doing a video on that, which is probably guaranteed to please nobody, on my Georgian Crossroads channel. So keep an eye out for that. It should be coming within the week. I'm going to actually wander out tonight and see what's happening. I've already got some footage and news clips and such, but the more I think about it, the more I realize both sides are right, both sides are wrong, as is often the case. But like I said, I'm not going to please anybody, but that's not my job, is it? Well, what we're going to discuss today is, speaking about, why are there differences in the way people think, creating political divisions and religious divisions and all sorts of divisions. So that's what we're going to discuss. I've been just a few, I'd like to say random thoughts, but they're anything but random. And, oh yeah, if you like the video, or even if you don't, you just want to follow me, hit like. I have had people hitting dislike lately, for whatever reason. I don't actually care. This channel doesn't make any money for me, except through the gifts that you have given me, which I'm really grateful for. And there is a subscribe link in the description section below. So let's go ahead and let's ponder this strange question. Why do people think what they think? So why do we think what we do? Or, as people really seem to want to know, why do they think what they do? Because truthfully, we rarely ask ourselves the question, why do we think what we do? We tend to look at other people, and we often think whatever they're thinking must be kind of crazy, they're misinformed, they don't have any access to the truth, they're not seeing things correctly, and yeah, they're probably not. But what makes us think we are? Where do we get our ideas from? Now, if you've been following this channel at all, you'll know I have several videos dealing with subjects like this. The effects of propaganda upon us. This is a very important thing. And I think propaganda tends to be forgotten because we always define propaganda, much in the way I started off talking about this, as the lies they tell versus the truth we hold. So you can see this is related, but I'm getting to some other point here besides propaganda. I have also got videos on desires. Why do we follow our desires? Should we follow our desires? Also, I made a video recently about our influences. Do you know what is influencing you? If you don't, that's a problematic thing. You need to know what is influencing you. And during recent events, I've been watching, and people seem to have no opinions about big issues. Then suddenly, within weeks, they do. I see this all the time on YouTube videos. Nobody is thinking about Russia or Ukraine prior to Russia invading Ukraine. Within a couple of weeks, everyone has fallen out according to their own presuppositions, which of course is related to propaganda as well. Same with Israel, Palestine. You could almost see the way that was going to go, although interestingly, that kind of split up the left a bit, whereas Russia-Ukraine split up the right a bit more. Of course, racial politics, where were you during the summer of 2020? How much were you posting black squares on your Instagram page or whatever? The gender issues. I mean, why is it in 2014 no one, hardly at all, in America worried about correct pronouns? Maybe a few crazy college students, but they weren't very numerous at all. And by 2019, this had become an extremely noticeable issue, and people suddenly had to worry about how they were addressing people, as they still do, and especially considering that this is historically brand new issue. I mean, literally from about 2014 till the present is when this issue came into being. And we went through the entirety of human civilization without ever thinking about this issue. It just was not an issue. People were people. You'd say, hey, you, she, he, them. And suddenly there are all these other things. How did that change? How did such a, historically speaking, brand new and very non-intuitive idea spread so quickly? And then there are feminism issues, men's issues, all of these things. And I often think about, how do people end up kind of being quarantined into the zone of thinking they are? Because you get pushed into these ways of thinking, and then after a while you can't challenge yourself. So I am sure there were lots of people who in 2014 never thought about gender issues to the degree that people have to now. Suddenly, they are, being pushed, and it's not which side are you on. It's, are you going to be on the right side, which is, somehow knowing everyone's proper pronouns, whatever the hell that means. Or are you going to be on the wrong side because you are a fascist and regressive person who won't go along, someone who needs to be, frankly, shut up. And so how did this thing get? And then, of course, what we're seeing since 2019 is finally a reaction. You start getting people, people who seem very left-wing in 2019 are now being seen as being right-wing, which is really weird. Someone like J.K. Rowling is, who's, talking about how inclusive her Harry Potter books are, but sometime, 2018 or so, she said, yeah, but you can't become a biological woman because biological sex is still a thing. People lost their minds on the internet. I don't know how it works in reality, except, of course, we are all influenced by the internet. But that's the propaganda discussion, which we are not having today. So let's think about, though, how we think individually. Let's examine our own sense of how we get our thoughts. So this is more psychological, cultural. So we start off in families, if we are fortunate. And that is already a big problem, because what kind of family? Is the family a broken family? Is the father absent most of the time? Is the mother neurotic? And what if the people in the family are cruel or cowardly or living in a delusion? So you start off, basically it's a crapshoot. You roll the dice and you get the family you get. You don't choose your family. You're and a lot of people say, but later I can. No, you can't. You can run from your family, but you can't change the world you were born into, the family you were born into, the situation you were born into. But that is psychology, where you find yourself. But no matter what you start off in a family, you are in one way or another taught to think a certain way. Now, I know there are some very progressive families who basically will say, well, we're not teaching our children about religion, or we're letting them make up their own minds. No, you're not. I wouldn't call that making up your own mind. I would call that basically passing on the family religion, which is, it's all cool until, of course, it's not. So religion, yes, people are brought up in a religion, even if that religion is, kind of wishy-washy, pseudo-spiritual leftism, or if it's just, we go to Walmart and shop and try to keep ourselves happy and we found some drugs religion, or, it's whatever you're brought up in that you focus around that has meaning. So, religion, yes, but not just any religion. So, for instance, I'm a Christian. I was not raised at all a Christian, which is why I can see some of these things very clearly. I've always found it strange to be among people who were raised as Christians. And there are different types of people. It's a very specific kind of thing. So, a Baptist who was raised in Shreveport, Louisiana, is going to think very different from a Georgian Orthodox Christian here in Tbilisi. And a lot is going to depend on the family's relationship to the church, on what kind of teachers they have. So, I can find two Baptist churches, and one has a very interesting, good pastor who seems to understand the Bible and understand some of the more difficult things. And then I can find you one where, I'm just thinking of a man right now, gave sermons that I can't remember one. He was a nice guy. He was much more pastoral than he was gifted in any sense of theology. And I can think of a pastor who was just the opposite. Great Bible verses, did not know how to visit people and talk to them. So it all depends. So even in a situation like that, you say, oh, they're brought up in the Christian religion. No, it's never that simple. It all depends on the things happening on a local, regional, family level. If your parents are telling you, we're going to church because you have to go, that's going to be very different from families who just go and basically imply, we're just doing this because we have to. In Alaska, I found what was interesting was the get out of church free clause was, teenage daughter has work on Sunday. Well, that takes precedence. Does it? Well, that's the message that was communicated through that family, that there was a priority there. Now, some people will say that they're letting their children decide what to believe, as I just mentioned. But that is every bit a belief structure. So whether a person is raised in that lack of belief, or which is actually a belief, it's a belief that things are too complicated, we should let our children have free choice. You're not letting your children have free choice. And this is one of the crucial points I'm getting to. You do have family politics. You have your country, region, city politics. You have your school I never had that. Some people will talk about the one teacher that changed their life. I never had that person. I did, however, after converting to this wild and woolly kind of Jesus people movement, had a few teachers there who really affected me because they were good at what they did. They weren't perfect, they made big mistakes, but they were good at what they did, and it reoriented my view on life. I suddenly saw that life had meaning and purpose. But I'm not talking about, this isn't simply to talk about conversion or something. Many of the things I'm saying could be true of a Hindu family or a Muslim family or someone in the Mormon church or whatever. These things are complicated, and every family grows up in a different situation. But here's the point. You grow up in a very specific situation. Everyone grows up in a very specific situation. Specific by region, city, who's at your school, are you going to school, are you homeschooled? All these things are very, very specific. And then there are the actual real world events in your area. So in one place, like Alaska, a good example, we didn't have a lot of what you'd call high culture there. So we had to kind of invent our own, which is how I got away with doing some strange puppetry stuff there. But basically everything was kind of folksy, which was on some levels good. On another level, you never learned what quality was, except now and then we did have the Moscow Chamber Orchestra come through. Somehow they were on their way to Carnegie Hall, and they had a couple nights free, and they stopped and played 2 nights in our rather nice little auditorium. Of course, we didn't appreciate it at all. We would clap between movements, and the poor conductor had to turn around and teach us essentially how to be concert goers. So that's that kind of area. Here in Tbilisi, in 2 nights, I'm going to see a ballet of Medea that's done by people I know. There is puppet shows related to the culture. So there was a puppet show that I saw last autumn of the artist Pir Osmani, who is a very important Georgian artist. I was about 3 months ago, I was at a philosophical supra, which is a ritual meal here, but the whole point of this particular ritual meal was to discuss philosophical issues. A lot of it going around Heidegger, whom I must confess I don't know that well, but I loved the idea and I loved being there. So it's a world of difference where you are. Many people don't have the funky little Alaskan culture or the higher class culture that I find here. They have instead a suburb in America where you have to drive 5 miles to get to a loaf of bread, where most of what they get is maybe they have a Cineplex with movies, maybe they have a big screen at home, maybe they just have their phone, where everything's coming to them from screens, where they spend a lot of their time driving. Maybe they can listen to audiobooks while they're driving or something. But, every situation produces a different kind of a person. So these are ground level things that are affecting us. And then there are other things. There are our friends and the conversations we have. But actually, I'm going to get back to the conversation thing a little later. But we'll just say our friends and the conversations we have with them. For many people, it's their friends where they really notice discussions about things. It's also with your friends that you start to notice, like, oh, this person thinks something different than I do. So what's happened is you're raised in a family. All these things are affecting you. The country you're from, the language you speak, it's all affecting you. But you start off with this template. So what I'm talking about with all of this so far is, this is all template. you have to interact with it, and depending on who you are, you're going to react differently in every different kind of situation from someone else. So you go into, as you grow up, in your teen years, you start to discover friendship. I would say more seriously. Obviously, as a kid, you have little friends, but it's only after you've started to go through some emotional turmoil and such. And I feel bad for the younger people today whose basic mode of friendship is online. That's like saying your basic mode of conversation is, or your basic mode of music is recordings. That's a terrible thing, because you're not actually getting music, you're getting recordings. And it's the same online. You're not really getting conversations. And I was told recently, where was this? Was it on Tammy Peterson? She was interviewing a woman who was talking about the problems of children raised in the digital age. And this woman gave this story about, in fact, I think it was something that she witnessed in her own life, where there were children, they might have been her own children, who would constantly be going through the little devices, and and they're like this during dinners and stuff. And I always say, like, well, if they're like this during dinner or during a family gathering, why can't anyone say, hey, this isn't acceptable in this family? I mean, you've had them since they were children. Why can't you stop them? It seems as long as they're in the house, they have to go by your rules. But of course, well, in our house, we try to let everyone just be themselves. No such thing. You're teaching them something very different than being themselves. You're teaching them how to be propagandized by the devices and the messages being pushed at you. So we start off with a set of propositions. We go out into the world, we talk with our friends, and we start to develop friendships and also disagreements. You have to go out in the world with presuppositions. And this is the thing that a lot of people, I've heard people say, oh, I can't believe that these Christian people or these Muslim people or whoever are teaching their children this one narrow thing. And then, they're not teaching them this broad thing. And I can tell you, as someone who grew up not in a Christian family, what I had was just as narrow as anybody else. Because for one thing, I didn't learn a lot about religions. For another thing, I didn't learn much outside of what my mother knew, which wasn't a whole lot. You are at the mercy of what kind of conversations and friendships and family you have. So, but nevertheless, you get these presuppositions, you go out into the world, and you start bumping your presuppositions up against other people. And this is where you have to start making choices about what you believe. Now, the worst thing is when you have families who, as I pointed out earlier, don't hold their presuppositions very well. In other words, they're hypocritical, or they're cowardly, or they're angry all the time. So maybe if I'm thinking of a family where the father says to the children, we're going to read the Bible now. Now, on one level, that's a great thing. I think reading the Bible to children is a great thing. On another level, if you do that and it just becomes rote religion without any meaning to it or discussion of it, if it's just something we have to do, you are setting your children up to reject it, essentially. And, as we go out into the world, here's the problem. Before children go out into the world these days, they're already getting messages off of what they're watching. Movies, television, YouTube videos, games, whatever. They're getting messages from that. And the worst thing to me in the world is someone rejecting the flimsy stuff that they were given to believe in their family on the basis of things they've seen on television. These hollow, one set of hollowness destroying another set of hollowness. It's just like, it's like, yeah, just give me a phone and I'm just going to scroll for a while. Because that's all there is. It's, I just want to have fun. I just want to live a life where things are convenient. I want to make money. Yeah, this is how you enter that life, is by living, that your presuppositions are hollow to start with because of your starting point. Which is why raising a family, which is not the discussion here, although it's connected, is so crucial, how that is done. I mean, one of the big questions I have quite often, because people know I've thought about these things, is at what age should we allow our kids to use a smartphone or a computer? And my answer is when they can articulate what it is. Now, that sounds very simplistic. Well, it's a device with pictures. No, it isn't. You can't. If that's your answer, you don't know what it is. It's not a little thing. These screens are not little. They are huge because they're the smallest sucker tips of a large octopus-like system of machinery bringing information to you. And it's not until the child sees how big the thing is that you can start to trust them to use one. Because prior to that, they think they're in control, of which they're not at all. They're simply an open ear, sound being poured in, open eyes, stuff being poured in, and they're not going to have any idea of why they think what they think. They're just going to be filled with prejudices and propaganda and a lot of stupidity. And as I was when I was young. Fortunately, as from my own story, you can get around that. There are ways to fight that. So in the next step, as we go out into the world, what happens is then we have our presuppositions challenged. We bring it back and interact with our friends, school, church, parents. And then we start to listen to the responses. All children eventually begin to see the flaws in their parents' godlike presence. And there's a transfer that has to go on, I think, for me as a Christian, it has to go on from the parent to God. The parent has to relinquish that all-encompassing authority that they had when the child was a baby and slowly give it up and allow questioning. And this is a point where many people fail. Interestingly, when we're young, we hope that the harshness or the faults or the cowardice or the anger of our parents or the neuroticism or the emotional problems, we hope that they will eventually change. And we hope this until, usually this happens during puberty, it becomes clear that they may not change. My basic feeling is, and this is a big issue, I'm not going to open up much, but I'm just going to say it, is that if a child doesn't learn to truly forgive their parents by the time of puberty, then it's going to be the long road around. It's going to be the long way to learn forgiveness. And for a parent to teach that, they can't just go up to the child and say, forgive me, I made a mistake, forgive me, I'm wrong, forgive me, I'm evil, forgive me. That would be ridiculous. But rather, the parent has to be able to articulate what they have actually done that is wrong, and not as a form of manipulation. We also inherit the hopes and fears from our parents. Optimism versus pessimism. Death is a big deal. How are we informed about death? I remember very precisely, not exactly the day, I was too young to keep track of the day. It's probably about 9 years old, 8, 9 years old. And I was playing with these little army men No, I was playing with, I had guns and stuff, and I was with my friends who were playing some sort of army game where we were shooting at each other, just invisible bullets. And then I was told I was dead, that I'd been shot. And I was near home, and I was just like, but I don't want to die. And then my mother says, well, you have to die. That was it. That's how I learned about death. A very, might I say, insufficient way of learning about what death is. To simply be told, you're going to die, just accept it, that's death. That's not death. Death is much more complex than that. But that's how we often learn things, is in these ways. This is one of the big problems with children being exposed to porn, or even children being exposed to their older siblings who are exposed to porn, or children being exposed to television shows that are talking about things way over their heads or way under their heads. And learning about sex that way, it's the wrong way. Which raises the question, how should we be informed? Now, a lot of people said, well, there should be sex education classes in school. Well, what is more likely that people are going to go through their whole life having sex, or that they're going to die? Well, a person can avoid having sex in their life. They cannot avoid dying. So it's interesting that there's no death education class, which I'm glad, because I think the sex education class have gone the wrong way. I won't go into all of that, but it is complicated. It really should be the parents' job. Eventually we come to a crossroads where we get so much information, new information, and we're paying attention to information more. So it's all this stuff. It's sex, it's death, it's what is love? Is there such a thing as love? It's nihilism, it's philosophy being disguised by television shows. It's postmodernism, it's modernism. You're getting all of this stuff, even if you're 12 years old and you can't define any of it. You're still getting the content. We come to a crossroads. Either we will continue to believe what we were taught, or we will reject it. Or keep or reject parts of it. And what often brings this to a head in our lives are key events within the family, within the culture. So, for instance, I'm always amazed by how many people lose their faith because they had a sick parent, particularly who dies when they're young, particularly from cancer, because cancer is so drawn out as a disease. It takes a while to happen. That people will do that. And I'm always amazed, and this goes back to the death education thing, I'm always amazed by people who say, how could a good God allow this to happen? And I'm sitting there going like, if you're old enough to articulate that, how come you're not old enough to have learned how difficult life is already? How come you don't understand that there's going to be an awful lot of suffering in life, and things aren't going to be easy? If you're a young, this often happens when a person, whenever it happens, if there's no one there who's explained to you how difficult life can be with compassion, and explain to you, and who will honestly say, there are things we don't understand. We don't understand. If you're a person who believes in God, and you haven't explained to your children how a good God can allow evil into the world to the best of your ability, then your child is going to have weird ideas about goodness and evil. A lot of people, I often think that people these days think that the good is what is seen to be good. You're good if you are a success. You're good if you look good. Whereas that has nothing to do with the good. And evil. People will say, how can God allow, wars and death and such? To which my thought is, well, how can God allow you to drop a plastic bottle in the street and walk away from it? It's the same thing. It's just one is a very tiny act of evil,
and the other one's a very big act. How can God allow a mass murderer to come through and kill 20 people? It's a bigger act. How can God? It's the same way. We don't question why God allows us to flip a cigarette butt still burning onto the street to create a small, tiny, lethal but tiny form of evil. That we don't give a shit about the way the world looks. We never question that because we think we're in control, and who does that harm? Well, you just take that argument and it scales up really well. You just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you need to have, and what this is coming to, well, I'm going to get to there. We are surrounded by forces much larger than ourselves. And one of the best things that a child can learn, that we can learn, and that we're going to learn eventually one way or another, is to learn how to deal with that fact. So, we are surrounded by mass popular culture, digital media, ideologies, and of course, ever-present propaganda, especially horizontal propaganda. The propaganda we pass on to each other, like crabs in a bucket, keeping the others from getting out. And I've discussed this in more depth. I've got a video about horizontal propaganda, which is one of the huge issues because this is how people change their minds. They don't change their minds because they carefully thought things through and said, yes, you're right, this whole pronoun thing, we really have to start doing that. They do it because everyone else is doing it. People are much more sheep-like than we give ourselves credit for. And sheep in the bad sense. They're sheep in the good sense too. Sheep who will follow the pastor. But they're sheep in the bad sense in that people just do what other people do. Maybe sheep is the wrong word. Maybe locust-like. Suddenly the situation gets good. There's lots of food to eat. The conditions are good. And then we mutate into this thing that goes around eating everything up, which pretty much describes the condition of the world today. Another thing that's important to learn is nothing is neutral. The family, I talked about the kinds of families, I've met these people so many times in America. It's just like, I don't want to give the child any of my ideas. You're giving the child your ideas 24/7. Nothing is neutral. Not the way you drive your car, not the way you go to work, not the way you go to school, not the devices that you use for entertainment and communication. Nothing is neutral. What do I mean by all-encompassing propaganda, which holds us in a way it never did in the past? If you lived in, say, an English village in the 19th century, before trains connected you with the larger world, so we'll say at the beginning of the 19th century, you would have a lot of time for free, independent thought. Of course, cynics today will say there is no such thing as independent thought. Well, yeah, because you are engaged in this larger conversation. There was still a church, there was still a city, the language you use and all of this. But here's the point. If you're walking down the road, a dirt road in an English village, there wasn't stuff in your ears. You weren't looking at a phone. You weren't bombarded by advertisements on the side of the road. If to get entertainment, you'd have to go to somebody's home or play an instrument yourself. Entertainment was created by living people, not by machines reproducing entertainment, except for reading. But reading is kind of in a different category, and we're not going to go there today too much. It's interesting that during the Baroque era, in the 17th century, early 18th century, people played music together and they had families of instruments. And you'll often see these violins and violas, different sizes. And that would be for a family. Little kids would play something like a mandolin or whatever. There'd be whistles and stuff that were made for younger people. And of course, way into the early 20th century, people still had parlor pianos that people would come over and you'd sing together and such like that. And even in my life, I'm 68, so in the 1960s, early 70s, I remember being in a world without constant exterior distractions. Vinyl LPs, what the kids today call vinyls, I don't know where they got this word. The LP, the phonograph record was stationary. You didn't take it with you. Your TV was stationary. It didn't go with you anywhere unless you had a little portable one, but you could watch it going down the road. Telephones were stationary. When you left your home, nothing followed you around constantly. Only radio, when I was young, was basically mobile in cars, and then there were these little one earpiece transistor radios. And it was only one ear, so you'd often see people with a little cord dangling out of their ear, and that was the first sign of what would eventually develop with the Walkman and the Discman, and eventually the iPod and wherever we are now, with just constantly being surrounded by images and words and sounds and music and all sorts of stuff, just smashing us in the face, in the ears, in the eyes, in the mouth. If you walk down the street when I was young, only headlines from newspapers and some rather primitive and quite, by our standards today, quaint store advertisements would catch your visual attention. And when you went for a walk anywhere, you had your own thoughts. And this is what I meant by a person in the 19th century. When they're walking down a dirt road, they're just walking down a dirt road. Yeah, they're thinking about the things with their family or church or whatever, but in fact, they can also be distracted by bees or trees or horses, other animals, and the same basically held true when I went on a hike in late 60s as a young teenager. We'd go climb a mountain or go for a hike, and there was nothing. Now, I remember an extreme act of stupidity in 1980 when I worked in Glacier National Park. And I, for some stupid reason, brought a small tape recorder in my backpack so I could listen to music along the way. I would later look back at this with extreme cringe. And I feel bad for the girl who came with me on that, because she put up with it, but I don't think she liked it. But now that idea is constant, of bringing your own soundtrack with you, bringing your own entertainment with you, because you can't be far from it. And this affects how we think. So this is how it works today. So Russia invades Ukraine. Suddenly, Ukrainian flag buttons appear all over the place. And then other people listen to one video by John Mearsheimer on YouTube, and conspiracy theories abound. So one group knows nothing about Ukraine but is wearing a Ukrainian pin. Another group suddenly says, oh, this isn't our political thing, and this guy explains why. And then suddenly there are all these people formulating these opinions about why America shouldn't have anything to do with it. So you get either side. And like I said, nobody knew anything about Ukraine 5 minutes before that. I did, because I've been thinking about Ukraine for a while. I'm also quarter Ukrainian. But you see people, and I still get this from people, people don't like a vacuum. They don't want to be able to say, I don't really know. Even though they don't know. But they don't want to be able to say that. They want to have something that gives them a bit of something solid to grasp onto. A conspiracy theory seems more solid than the reality, the chaos. I mean, like right now, like I said, there's political stuff going on in Georgia. But I can't just join the group that goes like, yes, we want the change. And the other group, no, we don't want the change. Because it's not that simple. And of course, people like me who see how complicated it is don't win a lot of friends politically, which is why I don't talk a lot about politics. And I'll often get people who, in comment sections and such here on YouTube, will often say things like, well, what about this? And they'll say something that they think is the most obvious thing in the world, and I'll just be like, it ain't obvious at all. And I just will generally not comment on that kind of thing when someone wants me to say something that they consider obviously political. Because the truth is, there are really very few things that are obviously true. It takes a lot of wrangling and wrestling to understand things. So now we're assaulted by information, entertainment, propaganda almost everywhere. And we lack the time to absorb the information that does come to us, to really understand these things. For instance, if you really wanted to understand what was going on with Russia and Ukraine, there's a lot of reading you need to do. You need to know some Russians and Ukrainians. And if you haven't done any of that, if all that you're getting is off of YouTube, your opinion, as I mentioned in my last video about your influences, you really don't know anything. Your opinion doesn't count. So that's how I'm going to treat it, because you're just repeating things. Walter Cronkite, the CBS anchorman for the news, who was there for decades, once said, he was talking about the arrival of the 24-hour news cycle, which came with CNN. And he said that delay of, they used to, for instance, submit a story, and it would take a weekend sometimes to go through, because they didn't broadcast these kind of stories during the week, or if they had a piece of film or something. So there was always time to reflect, should we show this or not? Is this something accurate or not? This isn't to say that they didn't, inadvertently or advertently put out things that they knew one way or another, this might not be accurate or might not be the truth. But he lamented the delay of that now people wanted news 24 hours, which of course the 24-hour news cycle of CNN in the 1990s now looks like, I don't know, going down the street with a walker in comparison to the speed with which information is relayed now. So even, for instance, Taylor Swift just put out a new album. Literally, now this was an album, there was about 30 songs related to the album, not all of them were on the album. Literally a day after the album was released, people had to put up their reviews of it. And I don't know about you, but I don't hear anything right away. I mean, I hear a song, I like that, but people are so involved with this, and there's this push that everything has to be instant. So you don't have time to actually ingest and appreciate the music. You just need to get something out on YouTube for your followers. But it's the same with everything. It's the same with the news. It's, some new event comes up, some video goes viral, suddenly everyone is talking about this like it's the most important thing in the world. This is how to jam your head with, it's like the bubble gum of informational nutrition. Lots of chewing, a little bit of flavor, nothing going on. Some sugar. It's sweet because, we got something to talk about. And it's amazing how many people left and right and center use this immediate stuff for their grist on their informational channels. When I was young, speaking of Taylor Swift, when I was young, looking for music took time. When I was young and first buying records, there wasn't even Rolling Stone in early 1967. Eventually, I think by the end of the year, there would be, certainly by 68. I was interested in the blues. Where do you go for a source on the blues? Well, I went to my local library who didn't have anything. I would see a couple of records in a bin in San Rafael, California. I would open it up, and inside there would be an inner sleeve that had pictures of albums. And then you'd say, oh, besides this Muddy Waters album, there's this guy named Howlin' Wolf and Little Walter and John Lee Hooker. And at first, these are all just names that mean nothing. There's no source, there's no book, there's no nothing that tells you anything about it. So it took a while to find information about something or to even hear it. And that was a pretty good thing. It took a while. I do appreciate the fact that I can find things very quickly now. But even then, this is one of the reasons why, if I can, I try to find a physical copy of something I'm interested in. Because it needs a bit of time, it needs a bit of cost, it needs a bit of effort to retain interest in it. It needs to sit on my shelf and look at me and say, hey, you haven't watched me yet. Hey, you haven't listened to me yet. Hey, you haven't read me yet. Why did you buy me if you're not going to read me? It needs to sit there and do that. And if it doesn't, files on a files sitting in a Kindle somewhere don't inspire that kind of thought at all. They're just files, and you can always look at them later. Even ordering books was a mysterious process. There was a huge book that came out once a year. I think there were 2 volumes, but there was a big book, I think it was put out by the Bowker Publishing Company, called Books in Print. I don't know if they still make them, because now we go online and look. I can find out most of that stuff. But there were no Amazon-like stores. Even the largest bookstores didn't have what you might be looking for. You'd look up a book in this book, but that didn't mean that the store you were in could actually order it. So it took a while. Even more puzzling was watching old movies. You had television, but you never knew what was coming on and if it would be cut up for commercials or cut up because they didn't like certain scenes. When I was young, there were no videotapes to watch. There were these weird things called Super 8mm silent films. So, for instance, you could, even in, I think, 77, you could get Star Wars as a 10-15 minute silent film on Super 8. Very interesting concept. And as George Lucas said, they're kind of designed to be silent films. You could live in a city like Paris or New York or London or Los Angeles, and you had much more access. In a sense, when I lived in New York City, I didn't think about the internet the whole time I was there. I didn't get online until I got to Alaska, because the city was my internet. I knew the bookstores to go to look for things. I never ordered books, hardly ever. I'm trying to think if I did. Did I ever order a book prior to being in Alaska to come to me? I think 1 or 2 books, but generally no. And starting in the 70s and going through the middle of the 80s, I think it was starting in the late 60s, were these what were called repertory movie theaters. And they would get, if you had a good programmer, they would get in movies, some very old. I saw King Kong at one of these repertory theaters in the 1970s on a huge screen. And I can tell you, King Kong, the original 1930s film, changes its meaning entirely on a huge screen. If you see it on a television screen, or God forbid, see it on a phone screen, it means nothing. You have to see it the way it was originally seen to understand its impact, and its impact was immense. So was Jaws, so was The Exorcist, seen on these huge screens. One of the reasons we have a lot of close-ups in movies now is because the people making movies know that we're watching these things on smaller devices. And all of this, what I'm talking about here is that there was all of this difficulty in the past of getting knowledge, but now we are where Paul Virilio, in his book The Information Bomb, talks about. Suddenly, all this knowledge has gone off. And it didn't mean we got to the point where we could understand it any better. It just meant suddenly we have access to all this stuff we have no idea what it means. So during a period like this, where it's much harder to get information, it's also much harder to be propagandized. So it means your thoughts are more, you're wrestling more with slower ideas, slower thoughts. Today, everything's coming to us at, as Marshall McLuhan says, light speed. There was too much blank space back in the day. Consider the following fact. How do people listen to music with some sort of tiny headphones today, earbuds or whatever, in order to block out the bigger world? And the ironic thing is that this kind of constant listening has had exactly the opposite effect. When I leave the home, I don't watch videos on the bus. I have rules about because I came to the smartphone much later than most people, I have rules because I watch how people are affected. Almost no apps, except what I absolutely need for keeping in touch with people who are trying to find me at the moment. So, for instance, I don't have any app related to YouTube or X, Twitter, or anything. I just have two main things that just one, Facebook. And the reason for that is I wouldn't want it, but that's how Georgians often tell you they're coming over to your house and they'll leave messages and they'll use Facebook for that. So fine. But I don't have WhatsApp. You just go on Instagram, forget it. But I don't have apps that do a lot. Why? Because I noticed people would suddenly get some notice. I remember I was with a friend and she was at my house and then she turned to me and said, David Bowie died. She just read an app. And I'm sitting there thinking like, I could have waited to hear that information. Why was it important to break into a real life conversation to say that? Couldn't I have waited until I got back to an actual computer or whatever and then taken the news in that way? Why do I need to know immediately when things happen? I don't. And it is that immediateness that creates more of an effect from propaganda because you don't have time. You're supposed to immediately react and you don't have time to react. And so you're immediately forming opinions and you don't know why. You literally don't. You don't have time to. So my feeling is the ironic thing is the constant listening to block out the effects of the world. Actually, what you're doing is getting the effects of the world straight into your ear without the effects of this strange reality impinging upon you. Okay, so you don't get to hear the cars and the crowds and the people and the noise. And instead, it's like, oh, let's create a superhighway for the stuff to go straight into my ears. And that combined with looking at a screen, you're not safe at all. One thing I learned, I said I carried this, it wasn't a boombox, but a small cassette recorder. I've never carried music with me since then. I did borrow a friend's Walkman in the early 80s, listened to a tape I'd made, which I would make tapes to listen to, and immediately said I will never walk around listening to stuff because I immediately said, this is changing the way I look at things. It is putting background music and words and such into my head as I'm looking at things. I don't live in a movie. I live in reality. I'd much rather be disturbed by it than to constantly be trying to hide from it, which means I'm letting it have its way with me full force. And of course, some of that blank space was there for conversation as well. That empty time was there to have conversations. And I had lots of conversations. And I, in fact, remember it was almost exactly the time, it was around the time Jaws came out in 1975. And I remember that was the time in my life where I remember I was young. I was, 20 years old? But conversations with people became more difficult at that time because people had gotten tired of talking and talking and talking because of the 60s. and they've gotten tired of that. And it's never really on a societal level come back in the same way. I would say that's different here in Georgia, but that was my observation in America, was that public conversation became a lot more fraught with difficulty at that point. One of the interesting things that's also happened, that blank space that's there for conversation, suddenly there's this weird thing happening where girls put stuff in their ears to listen to while they're on buses or walking down the street, and it's now considered impolite to talk to them because that means I don't want a conversation. Interesting. Which also says, oh, we found another way to spread the social contagions of the world, because no one's going to interrupt you. Yeah, there are creepy guys who want to have conversations. You should learn to deal with them instead of hide from them. Okay, that's a side note. One of the things I've been pondering for much of my life is, how does a person raise a child who doesn't succumb to the larger forces surrounding us? How do we actually encourage someone to think and not simply follow one of the many preformed molds of ideological thought? It can be done, and I've seen it in certain families. Notice I say certain families, which will tell you it doesn't happen as often as it needs to. But what are the ingredients that seem to work best? Now, as a Christian, I have often heard people say that, I'm a Christian. If I raise my children as a Christian, that should be good enough. And quite clearly, it isn't. Something is missing. So, Bible reading at the table, having little services for your children, pointed conversations about God, vacation Bible school, Christian videos, Christian music, Christian apps. None of this really, it's nice to get the Bible, I certainly admit. But even done in the wrong way, that can be counterproductive. That can be just simply making a little sheep in the bad sense of the word. Given the relationship of the child to the parents, in other words, the child sees the parent like God in the beginning and has to be weaned off that, and many parents are really bad at doing that, so it creates this tension, because it's like, not in my house you won't, and it's already a problem when the parents shut down the natural inquisitiveness of the children about the belief structure they were given. So it's not an attack, it's a natural question, and you have to answer it. And in fact, that seems to be the key. Conversation. Real conversation. Not pre-programmed conversation about, like I said, this can be applied to almost anybody, but I'm doing it as a Christian, so take it for what it's worth. The problem is you need some things which we've become very bad at. That is table talk and individual conversation. And I know many Christians, their idea of table talk is useless, because it's just, what do we do today? They're just as ironic as anybody else in the culture, without providing any explanations for anything, but without also providing these Christian interpretations of things also doesn't work. You need conversations. The kids I've seen who've turned out the best, when I've had a chance to watch them go through their families, are the ones who are able to drag something home. Here's this heavy metal record. Here's a George Michael song, I Want Your Sex. Here's a weird comic book. Here's a punk rock record. Here's this horror movie that I really love. And then to have the parents simply shoot it down. Well, that ended the conversation. There was no conversation. The children are bringing these things home for a specific reason. To say, what is this? Do you understand what this is? I kind of find it interesting. And they're opening up a conversation. If, however, the parent just looks at this and goes like, oh, well, that's nothing we should discuss, or that's from the devil, or that, if you're not a Christian, it's like someone brings home a Christian thing, and you go like, come on, you're not going to believe this religious shit, are you? What doesn't matter. It's just like, you bring it home, and you throw it down, and children are amazing at finding exactly the things that will drive the parents crazy. But the point is, I have a friend back in Switzerland, Priska Sandri, Dr. Schaefer's oldest daughter, and I watched her. She just got really fascinated by these things and would have discussions with them at the dinner tables all the time. And she would be interested in what was happening to the members of this group or that group. And she would look for in other words, she understood for her children what was going on so that they almost couldn't bring anything home that she would react to in a way that wasn't intelligent. And many, many, many parents would never dream of listening to the rap music that their children are bringing home in order to understand. In fact, it's not that you should listen to the rap music that your children are bringing home. As soon as you see the eye going over that direction, you'd better dive in, because you'd better know more about it than they do. And that's what parents just don't do. They just think like, well, that's your generation, I don't understand it. And as a person who has spent their whole life dealing with cultural issues, that is the exact wrong way to deal with it. The way to deal with it is, okay, well, let's talk about the difference between this punk artist and that punk artist. Okay, yeah, Johnny Rotten is a lot more rageful and intense, but there's an honesty there that I don't find in The Clash. The Clash are propagandists. And to have an argument like that, a conversation like that, around your children is going to teach them far more than all the little Christian things you do for them. Why? Because you're telling them, I take this seriously, I take these people as people seriously, I take this art as art seriously. And of course I'm using music and art and such, but it can just as well be scientific or intellectual things. It can be, almost anything opens up a conversation. But conversation is the key. And honest conversation. Not the kind of conversation that's looking for the children to say the right words. That's dishonest conversation. You want to make sure that by the time we're done with the conversation, you understand what I'm saying, right? You're still a Christian, right? Or you're still a secular liberal humanist, or you're still a Muslim, or you're still a Hindu, right? No. To raise your children so that they can grasp what's going on around them, you need to have conversations. And you should be having conversations with other people. And I'm not going to tell you everything you need to say or ask, because that's not the point. That is the whole point of conversation. But if children see that the parents take things seriously, they take things seriously. And I've never seen it fail. And maybe they may decide, I don't know if I believe what my parents believe anymore. But at least they will do so from an honest position, and not one of simply reacting to my crazy parents. It's a form of love, because a real conversation opens things up. It doesn't shut things down. The point of the conversation is not to get the kids to believe what you believe. The point of the conversation is to open things up and to understand the world. And if you believe in God, it's to understand the world God has made. To understand, evil. What is this thing? The more wide-ranging the conversations, the better. And without that conversation, then the natural desire for information and answers is going to be taken care of somewhere else. The peer group, friends, school, social media, movies, books, whatever. Seductive imagery, fashion magazines. It'll all take care of this for you and provide an answer that certainly isn't as good as a conversation would be. And by having the conversations, you too grow in intelligence. Without conversational skills, and I certainly didn't have them or learn them growing up, I have them now because I was willing, even as a teenager, to bash into them and have them. I started doing that around the age of 14, 15. Because I wasn't getting it at home. But without these open conversational skills, you just stumble around. And people will often settle on answers that temperamentally suit you. I was fortunate that the answers that opened up the world for me burst on to me from somewhere else beyond my normal viewpoint. I should have grown up to be much more of a, say, libertarian skeptic than I did. It just given temperamentally, whatever. I was arrested by this positively invasive Jesus people group who challenged my viewpoint completely. Now, that wasn't to say we were later safe from our own groupthink. Au contraire, we were not. We fell into our own problems. But by having that initial sense of contrast with what I believed and a new set of facts, I could then say, for instance, I learned that the Bible was authoritative. So then someone would come up to me with something that they would claim to be in the Bible. Now, I read the Bible a couple of times by the time I was 20, let's say 22, 23. And so when someone would come up to me and say, for instance, I was making music and someone said, you know, Bern, those songs you're writing are getting a bit dark. And I would say, okay, well, what does the Bible say about songwriting? Well, obviously the Bible doesn't have any section in it on how to write a song, but it does have a 150 psalms that were all meant to be sung. And one of those songs says, blessed is he who dashes your babies against a rock. That's just a line. The whole psalm is much different than that. But I said to myself, okay, well, I've never written anything that dark. So, whatever these people are saying, they are wrong. They are misinterpreting something. That is how I learned to think for myself. You learn to think for yourself by having a standard and then putting up reality against the standard and wrestling with it. That's how I also came to see that the Bible was indeed truth, because it understood the messy, sloppy darkness of humanity very well. And it understood that there was forgiveness and redemption, which those two things alone, without going into all the stories and everything right now, to me said, yes, this book understands the world we actually live in, this sloppy, messy world. This answers the questions much better than Sigmund Freud or Karl Marx or Nietzsche, you know. So it wasn't until I ended up at Switzerland at the L'Abri Fellowship that my ability to think really improved. But simply going to Switzerland by itself isn't some sort of universal cure. And in fact, I met people later in New York City who had gone to Swiss L'Abri like I had, and they didn't seem to get it at all. And so, you know, why is it I learned to think out of this process and they didn't? One of the things was, when I got there, I realized certain underpinnings, what they were actually saying to me. That is to say, they were saying, yes, the Bible is true, but you simply can't take things on, here's the crucial word, blind faith. Faith isn't blind. It requires some wrestling. It requires doubting. And when I first showed up there, I started saying some of the spiritual lingo that I was used to saying back in the Jesus people days. And I said, hey, I really felt God was leading me to come here. And they just said, freeze. Literally, when I went to the door to come to L'Abri, I started talking like that, and the person said, sorry, we don't talk like that here. We don't know anything about what God has told you or not told you. And so we simply don't use that language. Did they believe God did lead some people? Yeah. but they have no idea about it, and you're not going to convince them. And many people use that kind of language as a kind of spiritual blackmail. Well, God led me to this, so let me do it. So, but that immediately from the beginning put me on like, oh, okay, well, this is a different environment. Great, let's interact with this, and it started me doing two things at once: questioning everything, as Udo Mittelmann said. All questions are valid, but the answers aren't necessarily immediate or warm, but we are allowed to ask all the questions. And that was like, yippee, because I was increasingly getting the message back in California that there were a lot of questions you don't really poke around in these things. And now I realize I could, as a Christian, ask every question and challenge everything. And at the same time, I realized, there are a lot of things I'm not going to get answers about, and that's okay. It's okay not to have answers. So what I'm saying to you is this, something like this. We never start with a blank slate. And the people who think we kind of do, they don't live in the same world that the rest of us do. People who think you can just start off with no religion, no ideas, will just learn, you can choose as you go, are already giving you a vision of the world that doesn't seem to match the reality of the world we live in. So you can never start with a blank slate. We are always starting from where we are, where we're placed, and what we know coming against us. We are always starting from where we are and placing what we know against what is coming towards us. And at different points in time, both personal and cultural, we find ourselves open to new possible ideas. But these ideas can also harden again. Or as Pete Townsend said in Won't Get Fooled Again, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The new boss can become the old boss. The radical can become the conservative of a new generation. Ideas harden. And as has happened with in many corners of the post-Gamergate, post-Peterson, post-pandemic world, some people have stumbled onto some interesting ideas, new thinking patterns, but that's no guarantee that they won't slip back into a hardened form of them later. Ideology is a beast and a bitch, and it comes up after you, and everything can get contained. And what is really needed is conversations, and not the same conversations. I did a video a couple of months back where I talked about what I was getting out of books about theater theory. Why do I read something like that? That seems kind of off the main channel. Precisely because it's off the main channel. Because when people are reading and thinking the same things over and over and over and just reading a certain small set of things, they're not getting this thing that'll crack open the hardness which is going to develop. When I was in the Jesus movement, there was a guy who came up with this idea called truth freaks. And what the truth freak was in the Jesus movement was the person who came up with the new truth. They always saw the new truth. And they were always talking about like, ooh, we just learned about, a new, getting slayed in the spirit, or, deliverance ministry, or, this certain form of discipleship or something. And they always had some new approach to something. And they were like, suddenly this was all they talked about. You can't take the conversations for what is most important too far from that which is the most eternal. Eventually you've got to come back to these words like love and joy and truth and peace. The bigger words that we develop for these things, if they don't get us back to those words, we're going too far out from where we should be going. We have to answer the questions that are the most basic and root questions ultimately. And I find as a Christian, when Christianity gets too far from its Jewish roots, it starts getting into all sorts of problems as well. When people notice that modern democracy is another thing here that has many problems, then after a while they start playing with a very non-democratic ideas. They start mixing up the notion that there are forms of democracy that start to become totalitarian. The totalitarian vote of the 51% vote, whatever 51% of the people want is the truth. Well, no, it isn't. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean democracy should be thrown out. And so you have people now talking about, does America need a king and stuff like this. I'm sitting there going like, come on, guys. Really, seriously. Just because there are problems doesn't mean you throw it out. It's just like people talking about, love has all sorts of problems. Should we throw love out? No. Just because it is so highly argued over and worried like a dog with a bone. No. You have to get back to it eventually. When people get desperate for answers, they start looking in the wrong places. When people stop looking for solid relationships, they look to fix the loneliness problem immediately. It's like some women will joke, he's not Mr. Right, he's Mr. Right now. Well, that's not, it's getting to be night. It's getting to be a nightmare when that happens. I remember thinking, back in the early 80s, I said, it's going to be a nightmare for people who keep breaking up and coming back together, essentially the boomer 60s generation, but it's everyone after them as well, who keep thinking that they're going to find the right person. And so they keep breaking apart and coming back together. And I said, it's going to be a nightmare for a 50-year-old to go out on the open market again. Well, of course, we've reached that point long ago. That's now just a retro idea. Everything that eats away at our ability to think clearly submits us to the forces of fate. Jacques Ellul talked about this. He talked about, for instance, in World War II, the time to fix the problems of World War II was by 1938. After that, the fate of that is already happening. You need to start thinking about the post-war world, and that's what he was thinking about in the middle of the war. And he was thinking about that in 1938, because he recognized the time had passed. But these forces of fate are not capital F fate, but rather, once a certain amount of stuff happens, you can't stop the whole chain from rolling. All of the stuff that just keeps falling on us, and people just react. They react to the new situations. Suddenly you have to have an opinion about vaccines. Suddenly you have to have an opinion about this war or that war, which end up being contradictory to each other. Suddenly you have to have an opinion about, where we are, which you should, but not in that kind of neurotic sort of way. So we need truth with a capital T. Maybe you don't believe in truth with a capital T. Fine. You believe in something as foundational. Maybe you believe in questioning as foundational. I'm fine with that. But there's no sexy new truth coming along, ever. It's the old stuff, always. Nothing is going to come along to remove the painful difficulties of life. Life is going to remain painfully difficult. Once you understand that, you can move from the new ideas to deeper, richer ideas. See, one of the problems is people think that, this information bomb gives everyone access to superficial knowledge. And one thing I've tried to do with my life is, at least in some ways, drop below that. I've been much more interested in wisdom. Wisdom I look at as the intersection of truth and love. So it's not, if you just have love, well, a lot of people think they have that and they just have this compassion that just drips out, or these kind of gushy emotions or something. And if you just have truth, sometimes that can be too hard, too crushing. But wisdom finds a way to put them together so that you have truth and love in one place. I think that's what we should be striving for. That's where I think I'll stop. I don't know if this made any sense. I was kind of rambling. But the basic thought is this. You don't start off blank. And the people who think you do, you don't really have to listen to them because they are just as non-neutral as everybody else. And then eventually, out of that situation, you run into new ideas which you must confront. Now, you can just go bury your head, but you can only bury your head so long. So, for instance, let's say you want to stay home and watch movies. Well, how long can you do that before the messages in the movies bring you back to something like reality? There's some sort of message in a movie about living with your parents. And obviously, if you're just wanting to stay home and watch movies, you're going to try to avoid. There'll be, stories about love. Well, that's always a problem. You can't hide. There is no hiding. So you have to learn to think about the world around you. You have to engage with it. You have to learn to have real conversations with people that you can pass on to your children and to the others in your society, to invite people over to your house. I have another video where I talk about mediated, unmediated, and the kind of things you can do to bring a sense of reality back. In fact, I think what I'm going to do is make up a playlist, which I'll put at the end of this, which deals with all of these practical issues about propaganda and thinking and the kind of this zone between psychology and politics, psychology and ethics, but all of these things are kind of together, and that'll have more information for you. So thanks for watching, thanks for being there, and more coming up. I will have a great conversation that I had with Lucy Lethbridge about her book Tourists, which was very interesting. That'll be coming up soon. I have a new conversation with rock drummer Andy Edwards, who played with some pretty interesting people, and we discuss the origins of minstrel music, country music, jazz, things like that. And there are many more things coming up. I've been re-energized since finally feeling myself back. And in fact, I will be making the final library diary, because I got my stuff here. And I'll be showing you, I'll give you a little tour. Do you want a little tour of my library, my puppet library that I got in? Let me know if you do.
Okay, so there you are. You know what I think. I'm reminded of the scene in the movie Patton, where George C. Scott, doing his great, not impersonation, but interpretation of the American General Patton, gives everyone, looks at everyone in the eye and says, "Now you know what I think. And I will be happy to lead you sons of bitches into, whatever." Maybe I should find the clip.
All right, now you sons of bitches, you know how I feel. I will be proud to lead you wonderful guys into battle anytime, anywhere. That's all.
Anyway, thanks for following along. This is Bern from Tbilisi, saying Drobit. We will be back a little bit later.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
Booze and the blow-ins cop the lot. Anybody have any idea what I'm talking about? This is the refrain from a 15th century poem, a poem by Francois Villon. It says, no matter how you earn your money, you're unlikely to keep it, whether you hustle or swindle or con or cheat, because in the end, booze and the blow-ins, wine and women, take it all. Suppose you screeve or go cheap jack or fake the broads or fig a nag or thimble rig or nap a yak or pitch a snide or smash a rag. Suppose you duff or nose and lag or get your straight and land the pot. How do you melt the multi-swag? Booze and the blow-ins cop the lot. Suppose you try different tack and on the square you flash your flag. At a penny lining make your whack or with the mummers mump and gag. For nix, the dibs you grab at any graft, no matter what. Your merry goblins soon stravag. Booze and the blow-ins cop the lot. It's up the spout and Charlie wag with the wipes and tickers and whatnot until the squeezer grabs your scrag. Booze and the blow-ins cop the lot. This is William Henley's 19th century translation of Villon, rich in the canting language, the criminal slang of its day. It talks about debasers of coin, short change artists, dice mechanics, card hustlers. These people are my friends. I spent most of my formative years learning the techniques of deception. Now, many years later, I can tell you that I believe there are more differences between the cheater and the sleight of hand artist than there are similarities. Take, for example, an evening like this. If I perform badly, I might suffer the disapprobation of the audience or an empty house. If I perform equally poorly at the card table, I could suffer loss of limb or even life.